Foreknowledge by TheCreepyDark. The death of my grandfather shook our family greatly, myself in particular. I've never experienced the loss of someone, and never expected to lose someone so early in my life, but I have learned something that has shaken me to the point of no control. It was around 2 months ago that my grandfather was taken ill, at the ripe old age of 74. He had developed liver and heart issues. He was a smoker and a drinker, not particularly heavy. So it wasn't a huge shock at the time, though we didn't expect him to pass away as we didn't really understand the extent of the damages caused. Me and my family made regular visits to him, and I myself made many solo visits over the 2 months he was in hospital. I cared dearly for my grandfather. He was one of the wisest and funniest old fellas that I knew. While he lay in the sterile bed of the gleaming white hospital room, I sat beside him, reading him the current news stories, telling him the football fixtures and results. He was always a sucker for football. He'd grown up around the old Highbury grounds in London, so was a born and bred Gooner, which is an Arsenal fan for those who don't know football. Around week 6, 2 weeks before his passing, he confided in me. He told me how he wasn't scared to die, and how he was ready to move on to the afterlife. I remember crying as he told me. It tore my heart apart. As I said, he was a wise man, and he understood he was going to die. I hated hearing it, and as much as I hated it, it did lift my spirits a little to see how courageous he was, even at the end of it, to take death as it is, a natural cycle of life. His courage was something I'd always respected. I had a figure to look up to in life. Even from a young age, I could understand he was brave. His influence helped me a lot through my life. He asked me to listen closely once he finished his speech. He told me about something he'd found long ago, while on one of his digs. He was an archaeologist back in his heyday. He refused to specify any detail about the location or how he found what he had, despite my pressings. Instead, he just continued his story. He told me how he'd found something that could change the course of human history, but feared for it falling into the wrong hands, but equally could not die without informing me of its existence. Of course, he asked me to stay quiet, but his discovery is something that needs to be known, as much as it is an insult to him by breaking his promise. He gave me the keys to his home, and he asked me to pull up the floorboard beneath his bed and look inside the chest. He told me that I would find a book which would alter my life. I must admit I was sceptical of the old man's words, but he was never one to lie, and admittedly, he had my curiosity piqued, though he did ask me not to look until after he passed away, and I promised him I would do so. Thus, 2 weeks later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. It was bittersweet to know that he'd not suffered in the end, and I hope he's now in a better place. As I had promised him, I went to his home the following day. I walked around the house for a while, taking in the memories of playing as a child, coming round for tea on summer afternoons. It brought a tear to my eye to know that I would never see my grandfather again. I proceeded up the stairs after about half an hour of reminiscing, and made my way to his bedroom. It was well kept and clean, but had that musty smoke smell from decades of smoking. I walked over to the single bed and shifted it to the side. I could see the floorboard almost instantly. It was clear he'd removed it several times, as it was loose and chipped. I lifted it away from the floor and peered inside. I could see a wooden chest with intricate and ancient-looking carvings. I removed the chest from the floor and proceeded to put things back. And once the bed was in its rightful place, I sat myself down on it and inspected the chest. Its design was beautiful, unlike anything I'd ever seen before. I gathered he must have acquired it in a foreign market on one of his many trips excavating the world. I opened the chest to find the aforementioned book inside. The book was leather-bound and large in size, bigger than A4 and a good few inches thick. It must have had a few thousand pages. I was extremely confused as to why my grandfather would hide such an interesting book. I opened it up to the first page, and lay upon it my name and a date, the 21st of August 1990, the date of my birth. Upon reading the first few pages, I started to understand what it was. It was a story of my life. I was amazed. Such specific detailing about my arrival to the world. Everything from the people who were there, to my first tears, to my first meals. Admittedly, I failed to see quite how it would alter the course of human history at the time. I read on, awed. Each chapter seemed to be a highly detailed recollection of my life throughout my childhood. My first words, my school dealings, my clothes, my toys, literally everything. But I soon stumbled upon something that disturbed me. After a few hours of reading, whilst night was approaching, and skimming through this book, I read something that troubled me deeply. There was a section describing something my grandfather, nay, anyone, could have known. When I was around 5 years old, I was playing in the woods by myself. I had a shovel that my grandfather had given to me as a gift for my birthday, and I'd come across a soft patch of soil deep into the woods. And being the adventurous little scamp that I was, I got straight to work excavating this patch, trying to be like my grandfather on one of his digs. What I came across, however, was far from pleasant. I'd found the rotting corpse of a young woman. Of course, I was mortified, but equally young, and I was terrified that someone would find out what I'd found and hurt me. So I hastily covered the body back up and ran home white as a ghost. My mother picked up that there was something wrong, but I smiled and insisted that I was okay and just felt a little ill. I'd never picked up the courage to tell anyone what I'd found, so I buried the memory, such as I buried the body, and moved on with my life. Yet, this book, it had a scary retelling of that day. Worried, I continued on reading, only to find that this book had many things, all in scarily accurate, perfected detail. To this day, as I'm writing this, the vivid memory of that corpse still haunts me, and I often find myself wondering if it's still there, or if some other poor soul might have stumbled upon it. I suppose I let my grandfather down in the sense that I'd never found the courage to recount my findings to another person. A childish and selfish fear of the consequences kept me quiet, though I do feel many people in my situation may have had a similar response. With a sickness transpiring in my stomach, I pressed on. It came to my teenage years, again all with perfection in its detail. The story of my awkward virginity loss, the period of time I experimented with drugs, and my first time being drunk. I was terrified at this point, almost shaking. Even knowing this was getting too real, I continued. I don't know why, perhaps just sheer curiosity. Or perhaps because I noted how far I'd gotten through the book already. As I read on and on, I became more distraught with what I was reading. The book was accurate in a way I could never be when I thought back to the events that occurred in my life, right down to the complexity of emotions I had felt at the time. The first time I fell in love, the anger and angst I felt throughout the years of my puberty. I eventually read up to the thing that had happened only a few months ago. I'd visited some friends on the south coast in Southampton, just for a couple of weeks to have a little bit of a holiday. This book described everything from the journey there to the journey back, even the stupid phone call I'd had with my friend on the coach back. I failed to prevent myself from reading on. I'd already spent hours trawling through this book, reading the literature of my life. I came to the page which told of my arrival to my grandfather's house, my thoughts while reminiscing, my opening of the chest and picking up the book. I'd reached the point where it told me exactly what I was doing, reading this book. And further yet, it told me I would throw the book to the floor the moment I read that line, which is exactly what I did. I stared at it. I was scared. A fear I hadn't felt since what I'd stumbled upon as a child. The kind of fear that momentarily paralyses you and keeps you wrapped up in your thoughts. I tried to calm myself down and reason to myself that there was an explanation for all this. But in all honesty, the thought of my granddad owning this book and how he discovered it found its way to the frontmost of my mind. I gathered up the courage as I calmed myself down and picked the book back up, pondering on whether or not it was a good idea to continue reading. I appeared to have been passed a power which no human should ever have. I made the decision that only the book could tell me what I was going to do next. I didn't have the wisdom that my grandfather did, and in my delirium I felt I couldn't make a coherent choice. Lo and behold, that's exactly what the book said. Before I could read on, there was a knock at the door. I'd been so caught up in the mess I hadn't even noticed that the sun had risen to mid-morning. Whether it was the fatigue or the fact that I'd tuned out of reality, I couldn't tell you. But the knock made me jump and slam the book shut. I crammed the book into my bag in a hurry and ran down to see who it was. To my surprise, it was my mum. I could see almost instantly that she hadn't slept either. The bags under her eyes were extremely defined, her hair tangled and unkempt. She came in and sat in the kitchen while I made us coffee. Whilst the kettle was brewing, she started crying. I sat next to her, in some attempt to comfort her. We didn't really say anything to each other. I knew she was overwhelmed by being back in her father's home after his presence had left the world. And finding words to help in such a scenario is nigh impossible. She asked me why I was here, and I made up a lie about wanting to reminisce about the old times, to try and find some photos and such. I promised my grandfather I would not speak of it, and decided that if I ever were to tell her about the book, now was not the time. She smiled at me, and she told me that my grandfather was proud of the young man I'd grown into, to which I responded with a light chuckle. We made haste to head home. I locked his front door for the last time, and we drove back. Upon returning home, I made my way up to my room. I still lived at home with my parents due to the convenience of work and cheap rent. I sat down at my desk and I pulled the book out of my bag, and I stared at it for what felt like hours. I could feel the sleep deprivation setting in, and decided to let my body pass out and decide what to do the following day. Eventually, several weeks had passed by, in which I became more and more introverted. I spent my time majoritively deciding what to do with the book, debating whether or not reading on was the right thing to do. I had noticed that the book was nearing its end, and I could only hypothesize at what that meant, and I was terrified of being right. My family and friends grew increasingly worried about my well-being, checking up on me frequently. I just told them I needed time to recover from the loss in my life, and I'd be fine as the days went on. I just couldn't bring myself to confess the truth. I kept picking up the book, tirelessly going to continue reading, only to put it back down. I thought back to when I first discovered the true meaning of this book. I looked to it for what to do next, and did exactly as it said. I don't know why I hadn't thought of it before. It was all so obvious. I don't know how I could have been that idiotic. So I did exactly that. I located the point in the book in which my life was currently at. I want to say I wish I hadn't, but it would appear that destiny seemed to have other ideas, if such a thing were to exist. The book told me I would jump to the last page. It's funny, really, looking back. I didn't really have a choice in this. I was always meant for this, it would seem. The final words of the book depicted, rather graphically, my end to this world. You ever had a moment in your life where you truly stop thinking. That moment where your brain ceases to function, save for subconscious actions. That was me. I couldn't react. Every trace of emotion was gone. I felt like I'd been hollowed from the inside out. From that point onwards, what night's sleep I did get were restless. Every time I closed my eyes, I could only see people stood over my broken corpse, coroners taking away my body, my family and friends crying over my casket. I couldn't let that happen. The sheer thought of it destroyed me. I spent so many days trying to study the book, trying to devise a plan to prevent the course of destiny. I cut all communications with friends and family, becoming obsessed with finding a way of not dying. Nothing seemed to make sense. There was no solution. Weeks wasted coming up with ludicrous and ridiculous plans to flee the country, to try and find myself away from the location and the time of my seemingly inevitable death, but all to no avail. And then in a moment of sheer painstaking realization, I came back to reality for a moment. A cleared aura in my mind. I knew I couldn't fight this. That book has truly predicted everything in my life with accuracy beyond any scientific capability. And so I thought back to my grandfather, the key in all of this. I thought about what he would do, or rather, what he would want me to do. He would want me not to fight it, but to go on and face the situation with courage and not run away. I turned back to the book and located where in time I was, merely days away from my gory fate. So, I waited. I decided to get rid of this destructive burden. A gloomy day before my last, I took the book down to the woods. The one where I found the body as a child. I formed a small fire pit and I lit a small flame. I chucked the book into the fire pit and watched as the embers gently rose into the air, listened intently as the cackles of the wood burnt with it. I took one last moment to try and remember all the good things in my life. I took one last moment to try and remember all the good in my life, all the people I had loved and the people who had loved me. As the end was coming soon, I sat amongst the wilderness, silently, and took in the last sunset I would ever see as the sun fell under the skyline. I returned home, made my favourite meal, and indulged myself while watching my favourite TV show. I felt like a prisoner on death row, but my fate was far worse. My final thoughts turned back to the book and its origins. How my grandfather came about it, where it came from, but more so, was I the only person who had a book? I don't have enough time left to find out, but maybe, one day, that mystery might be solved. Until then, well, that's all it remains. A mystery. I write this on my final day. I can offer no further explanation than this. I just want to say I'm sorry to my mum. Please don't blame yourself, there's nothing you could have done to prevent this. I love you. Goodbye.